The sky was torn apart as streaks of fire burned through the clouds. People across Earth looked upward in fear as ships filled with soldiers crashed down in waves. Cities shook as thunder rolled from above. The ground trembled, glass broke, and towers split in half. No one could mistake what was happening. The invasion had begun, and there was no time left to hide. Captain Ethan Cross stood inside the base outside Nevada. He had trained all his life for combat, but nothing had prepared him for this. The dark sky above him carried shapes larger than mountains. He saw them glow as they entered the air, and he knew they were not here to talk. They had come to rule. Ethan knew the choice was clear: fight or fall. His heart pounded, but his voice held firm. He gathered his soldiers near the ruined defense grid and said that today they would stand for Earth. In New York, Claire Morgan ran through halls where alarms screamed. She was an Air Force strategist, known for her calm mind even when the world seemed to be ending. Her maps were scattered on a table as leaders argued over plans. Claire silenced them with one simple statement: if they let fear command them, everything was lost before the first battle began. She stood straight, her eyes set on the flames lighting up the skyline. She promised herself she would never surrender. On the streets below, families tried to run as fire tore across buildings. Cars swerved and crashed. People screamed for loved ones who were lost in the smoke. Yet in the heart of terror, courage appeared. A group of neighbors carried a young boy whose leg was trapped under rubble. Another woman dragged water hoses from a broken truck to stop the flames spreading to nearby homes. Even in panic, some refused to be victims. Above them, the Queen watched from her flagship that circled Earth. Her crown shone beneath the cabin. Lights and her army of loyal men lined the chambers around her. Her voice was cold and steady. Earth had forgotten the throne for too long, she said. Now it would bend or burn. Orders moved swiftly down the line. Entire fleets set a course to take the great cities at once. In Chicago, the invasion fell like lightning. Ethan received word of towers falling and soldiers trapped but still holding ground. His men were tired and their weapons seemed too weak, yet the fire in their eyes told him another truth. They would rather fall with rifles in hand than kneel before a ruler who saw them as pawns. Ethan told them that Earth was not lost. Not yet. He reminded them that every city that still stood was a sign of hope. Claire prepared broken squadrons for the defense of Washington. Many of the pilots had never flown in real combat, but she took time to look each one in the eye and remind them that they carried the weight of billions. Even if their planes fell, their stand would echo beyond their deaths. She whispered once to herself that history was watching. They could not fail. Everywhere across the planet, the invasion tore at Earth. Bridges cracked, oceans churned. Fire painted the horizon. But for every tower that fell, another group of humans raised a blockade. For every burning street, there was a soldier or citizen ready to fight in the ash. Fear was heavy, but pride was heavier. The first day ended with smoke across the world. Cities were broken, bases torn apart, and the armies of the Queen marching forward. Yet Earth was still alive. Though the night burned, voices in every corner of the planet repeated the same vow: we are still here. We will not give up. Day after day, the fight grew harder. The first shock of the invasion had passed, but the war had only begun. Smoke rose from many cities, and the sound of burning steel never left the air. The people still alive knew that the world would never return to peace until they proved they could resist. Fear made the air heavy, but courage burned brighter. Ethan Cross did not rest. His eyes looked tired, but his voice stayed strong as he guided his soldiers through broken highways. The defense grid that once protected the West was now useless, so he ordered his men to fight in smaller groups. He told them that every street could be turned into a weapon. Every stone and every wall could be used against the invaders. They had no choice but to turn their home into a battlefield. One night, Ethan found an old truck in the desert town near the base. A man named Daniel Price, who had once been only a mechanic, worked with him to fill the truck with fuel and explosives. When a column of enemy machines moved into the valley, Daniel drove the truck straight into the center and set the fuse. The fire rolled through the steel and the machines toppled over like broken statues. The soldiers cheered, and the story of Daniel spread quickly as proof that even ordinary men could turn the tide. Far across the ocean, Claire Morgan sat in what was left of an airbase. The walls were broken and the runway cracked open, but she used it as her command center. Pilots came to her one by one to ask for orders. She studied their faces and knew many of them were far too young, but she also saw fire in their eyes. With her calm voice, she told them the plan. They would rise before dawn and use every bit of speed they had to break past the blockade above the coast. If they succeeded, they could bring back weapons stolen from the enemy and give Earth a fighting chance. The next morning, the sky filled with the roar of engines. Claire stood on the broken runway and watched them rise into the air with trails of smoke behind them. She whispered a promise that their names would not be lost. Some of the planes never returned, but the survivors landed with crates full of weapons. More powerful than anything Earth had used before. The mood of the camp lifted for the first time in weeks. In the ruins of Berlin, Nina Carter worked day and night. She was a medic, but she also fixed the rifles of her unit when soldiers dropped them in broken mud. With her hands covered in dirt and blood, she reminded the men that she would stand with them no matter what. At night, she spoke softly about her family that had fled south. Her words gave hope when the soldiers wanted to fall asleep and never wake again. Many would later say that her courage saved more than guns ever could. Even children played their part. In the farms of rural France, a group of boys and girls carried food to men hiding in barns. They knew the danger of being caught, but they carried bread in baskets and water in buckets, as if nothing on earth could stop them. One boy said that if he was too young to fight, then at least he could feed those who did. Every attack, every act of courage was small compared to the power of the Queen's army, yet together they grew into something greater. For every city that fell, another battle line rose. For every soldier that was captured, another citizen picked up a rifle. Earth was slowly changing from panic into resistance. By the end of the second week, the skies were darker than ever, and fire still ruled the nights. But now there was something new. There was belief. Stories of Daniel's truck, Claire's squadrons, and Nina's care spread from mouth to mouth. These stories were stronger than fear. It became proof that Earth would not surrender no matter how many ships filled the sky. Winter winds swept across ruined cities as smoke rose into the sky. The invasion was pressing harder each day. Towns that once felt safe were now in flames. The Queen and her men were determined to crush every last piece of resistance. Yet even as the world bent under the weight of fire and steel, the people of Earth refused to give up. Ethan Cross led his unit through the hollow streets of Chicago. Snow mixed with ash, and the air tasted like metal. He and his soldiers moved slowly between broken buildings, searching for supplies left behind. Everywhere he looked, he saw walls torn apart and streets buried in rubble. It was a picture of death, but also of stubborn survival. From burned homes came survivors who still offered food and blankets to the tired soldiers. Ethan told them that their courage was the true shield of Earth. In the mountains of Colorado, a hidden command post had been formed. Leaders from across the world met in the frozen bunkers to speak of their next move. Claire Morgan was among them. She stood before the maps placed on rough stone tables and explained her plan. Earth could not keep fighting by defending every street. They had to strike at the center of the enemy's power. Her calm voice carried over the cold air, and everyone listened. She said they must strike the flagship of the Queen and bring it down. At first, some called it impossible. Her eyes were steady as she answered, "Nothing is impossible when the very life of Earth is at stake." To carry out such a plan, they needed pilots. That was when Lucas Hayes came forward. Lucas had once been a young racer known for reckless daring, and now his skill with captured fighters was unmatched. His grin carried a spark of madness that unnerved some, but inspired others. He told them he would fly through fire itself, if it meant striking at the fleet. He had already faced death many times, and treated it like an old friend. The plan was dangerous. To even reach the sky above Earth, the pilots would have to break through the blockade of armored ships that never left their posts. Ethan took command of the assault groups on the ground, whose job was to create chaos in the cities and draw attention away from the skies. Claire stayed at the mountains to guide the strike with her maps and radios. Lucas and the chosen pilots prepared their fighters with what little fuel and weapons they had. The night before the attack was silent and heavy. Soldiers sat in broken halls, speaking of their families and homes they might never see again. Nina Carter walked among them, binding wounds and reminding them that courage was stronger than fear. When one young man said he was afraid he would fail, Nina placed her hand on his shoulder and told him that even to stand and fight when fear filled his heart was proof that he had already won. Ethan's unit stormed into the ruined streets of Chicago with rifles blazing. Explosions shook the ground as his men clashed with the enemy. Smoke turned the sky dark and drew the eyes of the invaders away from the mountains. Claire's voice came through the radios, calm but firm, guiding groups into place. At the same time, Lucas Hayes led his squadron into the sky. Their fighters rose like sparks from fire, cutting upward into the cold air. The battle in the sky grew fierce as enemy ships moved to crush them. Lucas flew with skill that seemed beyond human. He dived between fire and steel, drawing lines of flame behind him while shouting to his fellow pilots to keep pushing forward. One by one, fighters fell, but the survivors kept climbing higher. For the first time since the war began, Earth was no longer only defending, they were striking back. The people listening to the radios in the bunkers heard the distant thunder above and felt something greater than fear. They felt hope. Hope that the plan, however mad, might reach the heart of the invading force and break its crown forever. The sky was a storm of fire. Ships filled the horizon and rained blasts of light down toward the earth. The great flagship moved above them like a dark mountain floating through the air. Its engines burned brighter than any city. Inside that giant vessel, the Queen stood on a high platform beneath her crown. Around her stood lines of her armored men, their faces cold and loyal, their weapons ready to strike. To them, Earth was nothing more than another land to own. But to the defenders below, Earth was home, and none were prepared to give it away. Ethan Cross led the first group of soldiers aboard small captured carriers. Their mission was to storm the giant flagship directly. Many of his men had little chance of surviving, yet their spirits held firm. As the carriers broke through the outer shields, fire shook the skies and shook the ground far below. Ethan shouted for his men to hold steady, and they answered with proud voices. They knew this fight would decide the future itself. At the same time, Lucas Hayes swept through the clouds with his squadron. His fighter twisted between enemy blasts, his hands steady on the controls. A trail of broken ships followed in his wake as he laughed sharply into the radio, daring the enemy to bring more. His courage gave strength to the pilots who flew behind him. Each roar of his engine was like a call to strike harder. The blockade around Earth, once thought impossible to break, began to open. On the mountain base, Claire Morgan followed every detail through the sound of crackling radios. Her maps were spread across the table, and her pencil marked new paths faster than her aides could follow. Her voice guided the fighters into stronger positions. She ordered her fleets to curve and strike where the enemy was weakest. Her calm directions cut through the chaos of war. Even as the sky thundered with fire, the pilots trusted her voice. She became the mind of the resistance, while soldiers like Ethan and Lucas became its fists. Ethan's team crashed through the side of the flagship and spilled into dark steel halls. Smoke filled the air as men ran in ordered steps, rifles raised. Clash of steel rang through the corridors as streams of soldiers fought at close range. Ethan pushed forward, striking down enemies as he led his team toward the throne chamber. Every wall shook with explosions, and every corner held danger, yet his eyes stayed forward, set on the goal. Inside the flagship, the Queen stood tall as her chamber echoed with the clash of battle. Her loyal men closed ranks, blades gleamed, and voices shouted oaths of protection. She raised her hand once and silence fell around her. She declared that Earth must submit or perish. Her voice was cold and strong, but Ethan's heart grew hotter with every word. He answered through his weapon fire and through every step that pushed him closer to her dais. Lucas fought outside, drawing ships away from the flagship with wild skill. His fighter was torn by fire, but he refused to fall. Each dive he made opened space for another pilot to move toward the massive vessel. His comrades shouted his name with pride as he carved new paths into the wall of fire. He swore that he would not rest until the flagship burned. All across the planet, the people heard pieces of the battle through broken broadcasts. Families in dark shelters and soldiers in ruined trenches knew the decisive fight had begun. Breath was held as blasts echoed through the skies. Every man and woman prayed in silence that their defenders would reach the throne. Inside the shattered halls, Ethan raised his hand to signal a final push. His men charged with cries that shook the walls. The battle for the heart of Earth's freedom was reaching its fiercest moment. The throne chamber awaited, and with it, the queen whose crown had set the world on fire. The throne chamber shook as fire and steel tore through the flagship. Ethan Cross led his soldiers across the wide hall, where pillars burned and walls cracked from the force of battle. His boots struck the floor with each hard step. His rifle was nearly empty, his body covered in smoke. But his eyes stayed fixed on the crown that shone at the far end of the chamber. The queen stood tall, her robe torn, but her pride untouched. Around her marched her loyal men, their blades raised, their shields bright beneath the firelight. She declared to the chamber that earth must kneel, that every life would serve her order. Her voice was sharp and steady, and it echoed across the hall. Yet not a single man of Ethan's unit bent a knee. Instead, they lifted their weapons and pressed forward. The clash was like thunder inside a storm. Blades cut against rifles used as clubs as men fell to the floor. The heat of burning walls mixed with the smell of blood and smoke. Ethan fought side by side with Daniel Price and Nina Carter, who had taken up arms though she was a medic. Her aim was true, and her courage carried those around her. Daniel struck down one opponent after another with a weapon taken from the enemy itself. They carved a path forward through the line of guards. Outside, the sky itself was on fire. Lucas Hayes led the last of his squadron against the ships that circled the flagship. His own fighter was broken, and the warning lights screamed at him, but he refused to back away. He guided his craft straight into the center of their formation, firing until smoke poured from his wings. He shouted through the radio for the others to finish the mission no matter what happened to him. His engine blazed and his ship smashed into the largest cruiser near the flagship. The two vessels exploded in a burst of light so bright that it painted the earth below in fire. Lucas was gone, but his sacrifice opened a gap wide enough for others to strike. In the chamber, Ethan's unit finally reached the dais. The queen stepped down from her throne herself and drew a blade that shone like silver. Her men formed a circle around her as she walked forward. She was more than a ruler. She was a warrior trained from birth. Her blade struck fast against Ethan's weapon and sparks filled the air. Each strike shook his arms with pain, yet he held on with all his strength. The duel lasted long minutes. Her blade slashed across his shoulder, but he fought past the wound. His rifle cracked against her guard and pushed her back a step. The circle of guards pressed inward, yet were forced to fight his men, who held them back with their last strength. Nina shouted for Ethan to stand no matter the cost. But Daniel threw himself into the line to clear a path for him. At last, Ethan forced his way forward. He seized a fallen blade and drove it into the control nexus that powered the Great Throne. Fire erupted as the systems failed. The chamber quaked as alarms roared. The queen staggered back, her crown falling from her head as the throne collapsed behind her. Loyal guards shouted in fury and shock, but the fire spread too fast to be stopped. Outside, people across Earth looked to the sky and saw the great ship burning as it began to fall. A cry of hope spread through villages, bunkers, and trenches alike. For the first time since the war began, Earth was no longer trapped under fear. The people knew that the impossible had been done. Ethan collapsed on the floor while smoke rose around him. Claire Morgan's voice came through the broken radio, calm as always, but filled with pride, as she said that Earth still stood. Her words reached every fighter who still held a weapon. The defenders cheered, though their bodies were weak. The sky was still filled with fire, cities were still broken, and many lives were gone, yet Earth remained free. Humanity had faced the crown and shattered it. They had proven to the galaxy that they would never kneel to chains or fear. Though the night burned, the dawn would rise to a world alive with hope.